Hello, everyone. Welcome to Luohan Webinar. I'm your host, Sang Choi. Today, we are very honored to have one of the leading experts on antitrust, the Professor Sokol from the USC, to discuss one of the most important issues of these days, which is the relationship between the data and competition. Daniel Sokol is the Crayon Franklin Chair in Law and the Professor of Law and Business at the USC Gould School of Law and affiliate Professor of Business at the Marshall School of Business. He serves as a faculty director of the Center for Transnational Law in the Business and the co-director of the USC Marshall Initiative on Digital Competition. Professor Sokol is among the top 10 most cited antitrust law professors in the past 5 years. He is a member of the American Law Institute. He also serves as academic advisor to the United States Chamber of Commerce and as a non-governmental advisor to the International Competition Network. His work has appeared in a variety of top journals, including Strategic Management Journal, Journal of Law and Economics, and Harvard Business Review. In 2021, he also published his latest book called The Cambridge Handbook of Compliance. Today, he's going to talk about his new project called Cookie Intermediaries. Does competition lead to more privacy? So we're going to have 1 hour of the presentation. So the Professor Sokol, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. First of all, thank you. It's a great honor. Good morning to everybody in China. Good evening to everybody in the Western Hemisphere, and to anyone with insomnia in Europe. Hopefully, this will keep you up for the next hour before you go back to sleep. In short, I welcome comments, but just let me give you a 20 to 30 second version of the paper. Increasingly, we seem to care about the interaction between competition and privacy. We care a lot about data. And so what we do in this paper is look particularly at data brokers. And we're able to do so because now we have registries in the United States, in California, also in Vermont. And what we do basically is, many of you are familiar in the operations research and marketing research about supply chain, what happens when there's some kind of supply chain problem, a product defect. In many ways, we're looking at a very similar type of phenomenon, but in a digital setting. We're looking at what happens when firms trade data with each other, that is, they buy and sell data. They use intermediaries, these data brokers or data controllers, and at some point there's a data breach. So there's some kind of downstream problem where your data ends up on the dark web. And the big question, and this is actually plays Sang-woo to what you already alluded to, and the prior book was focused on compliance. In many ways, this is in part a compliance issue, which is if we have some kind of compliance problem, here a data breach, who caused it? How do we, to what extent do all kinds of factors involving competition across firms either weaken or strengthen the ability of firms to comply? And so in many senses, these are very old questions in economics and related fields, management/strategy, marketing, information systems. We have a privacy overlay. The study of privacy goes back, at least in law, more than 100 years. Focusing specifically on this, Louis Brandeis wrote a seminal paper on that. Well, what we're going to show you is perhaps counterintuitive to the theoretical contributions. The theory tells us that competition and privacy go together hand in hand. Specifically, when there's a lot of competition, that improves privacy. What we actually are going to show you is that empirically, at least in our setting, competition and privacy are in tension in the following sense. The more concentrated the market is, the less likely we are to have some kind of data breach that we are able to find on the dark web. And we do this at 2 different levels in terms of where the data breach might happen. So I have a little bit for everybody. And for those waking up, you're wondering, cookie intermediaries. What do I mean by cookies? We'll get to that a little bit later, but I don't mean cookies like Cookie Monster. Many of you fondly remember Sesame Street, and he would eat a cookie. No, I mean the kind of cookies where you track data. So with that, I'm going to go into detail about the paper, but I'll stop there just in case there are any questions, because I am probably 20 seconds over before someone in econ would have already raised their hand and disagreed with half of the premises I have in the paper. So I'll just stop there. Wow, everyone is so much more polite here. Okay, I'll actually start my presentation then. So with that, let me give you a sense of what we're doing and what we're looking at. So we have a firm, right? Could be any number of firms. It collects consumer data, through an app, for example, but it partners with a data broker, wants more and more data. Why? At a fundamental level, the more data you have, the better you can make predictions. The better you can make predictions, the more you can monetize that data in a way that gives you competitive advantage. Well, we know through these data exchanges that data brokers do all kinds of buying and selling of data. I say we know this, but actually we know very little. And so around the world, we know that these markets exist. These markets tend to be fairly opaque. And we've seen these kinds of government inquiries on how these markets work. In fact, there's a current market investigation that the ACCC in Australia is doing specific to data brokers. But we've seen this, for example, in the United States in 2014, where the result of a study by the FTC is simply, we don't really understand these markets, but we should be concerned. Why? Because we're concerned about privacy, and we are concerned in some ways that all this handling of data, so many hands touching the data, means at some point it creates more opportunities for data breaches, or maybe a nicer way, data leakage. And the place where it gets leaked to is the dark web. And we'll talk about that. But that's basically where we're going in this paper. So let me explain what a data broker is. There's quite a bit of navel gazing in the literature. We kind of understand the core function of data. They buy and sell data. They're an intermediary. But you know what I really love? We know what a data broker is because the law actually defines what a data broker is. There's nothing better than when the law actually tells you what something is. And this is literally, I pulled on the left-hand side of the screen, what the Vermont statute has for a data broker. Business that knowingly collects and sells or licenses third parties the brokered personal information of a customer with whom the business does not have a direct relationship. Again, intermediaries. Much of the time, data brokers operate without the knowledge of the consumers who were using that first party app, for example. Just about every US consumer, we focus on the United States, but of course, this is a global issue. Has data that data brokers are getting, and you'll see on the right-hand side exactly how data brokers get the data, and I'll go into a little detail what kind of data it is. And so they're basically buying and selling this data, and you see all the different ways that we can basically get data and who might use it. Some of it is publicly available, great, but some of it comes from social media, some from your purchasing history, some from these loyalty cards, some from these video games that we all play. Given that it is China, I guess we're playing NetEase, but possibly we're playing Activision Blizzard games or any number of other games. And we are buying and selling data. And it turns out not all data is the same. Certain data is more valuable based on whose data we're collecting, and we'll go into more detail for that. Sad to see that the expected parents' data is worth so little, maybe because we can all predict what they need diapers, wipes, onesies. There you have it. So I think this slide is a bit helpful just to give you a sense of how much data is being bought and sold and how many data brokers are worldwide. So for those of you wondering what's the denominator, we think that there are 4,000 data brokers. We have a data broker registry that we're going to talk about in a bit. But it's a huge industry, huge industry. This information gets used in all kinds of decision making by firms at all kinds of different levels. What kind of data do they collect, though? Turns out everything. All kinds of personal identifiers: age, gender, education, employment, political views, your credit rating, alcohol and tobacco interests, whether or not you're a gambler. And you see two different kinds of data brokers here and all the different kind of attributes that you have, and you just basically see everything. So there's a broader set of political and social issues about, should we be collecting data? Is there meaningful consent? These are all great questions. We don't discuss this in the paper at all. Our paper is very simple. There's data. It's part of a market. It is being bought and sold. This is the big takeaway. So you do get a sense, though, of how sophisticated these data brokers may be. So I gave you the oh, go ahead.
Can I ask you a small question?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So are there? So you're talking about the specifically talking about data broker markets.
Yes.
Are there? What is like? Are there also the public firms? Like the IPO firms?
Yes. So actually, we're able to look at publicly traded firms that are data brokers. And so we'll get to that. There are some private firms. Some of these are very well-known firms. And actually, if you look at the companies, you'd be surprised sometimes who the data brokers are. So there are ones that you would assume are data brokers. Let's say Equifax, right? They do credit scores. But, Google's a data broker. Microsoft is a data broker. Plenty of companies that you wouldn't have thought about are actually data brokers selling third-party data. And we'll get to sort of what some of those implications are when they're in multiple stages in the supply chain. So
actually, I want to follow, have a bit of the follow-up question about that. So for example, about the Google, it's like a bit hard to distinguish between them, but I think they're selling as a service, not data. So it's kind of do you have some definition of what is the data and what is the service? Because most of the data companies they're selling service, right?
Right. So I have an easy answer for you. Do you know who a data broker is? The companies that register as data brokers, right? Because they've self-identified.
Okay.
So that's the easy answer for you. But what about all these other companies that say they're data brokers? Many are actually selling both data and services. But there are certain databases where companies have identified in some way that they're selling data. They may be selling data as part of a bundle of other services, but for sure they're selling data, third-party data. And so we're able to isolate that. But the issue that you raise is actually a very important one of, well, there's a lot of other stuff going on here too. And that's right. But here we're looking specifically at those that are using cookies, right? So you have your first-party data holder. So let's imagine, for example, we're Nike. We have all kinds of information about who buys our shoes. And they collect lots of information, who goes onto the Nike website, who goes onto the Nike app. They share that customer information. One thing I love to do in my undergraduate marketing class, I actually have them look at the disclosures, the ones that you have to give, about the data practices. And I ask the students, are these companies sharing data? And they're like, yeah, they are. I'm like, why don't you read it a little more carefully? because they're incredulous. Like, why would they sell data? And I'm thinking, how do you think they make money? Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how. So Sangu, you asked another great question, or at least you hint to another question. How much are they actually making off of the data versus the services? The answer is we don't know. And this gets to the publicly traded question, because companies simply do not break down revenues at that level. So if you look at what is disclosed in 10Ks, we don't have, say, by division, how are the revenue breakdowns. We're just told generally, here are profits, here are losses. Very rarely do we have a company like Alphabet that will at least break it down to, so how much is Google making versus how much is Waymo making. That's very, very rare. And even there, we still don't know if Google, are they making the money off of the searches, or are they making money off of selling the data? Again, unclear. We just don't know. But it's a great question. This is why we have theory papers still. So people wonder, why has theory died? Theory hasn't died. Theory is really important, largely because there are many empirical questions we'll never be able to answer. But with that, let me get back to sort of how I want to conceptualize this, because I think it's helpful visual for you all to think about. We have our first party and sort of going down a vertical chain. At one level, our first party data holders are what are called partners. Quote unquote share. They sell information to data brokers. These data brokers then end up sharing customer information sometimes with other data brokers to get even more robust data sets. And then at the next stage, they sell it to companies, sometimes to other first-party providers that have already sold them data. They're both selling and buying data. Sometimes they're selling it to companies that we're not selling in, but they were buying it. So what we know, at least what we think we know, is that data brokers are competing with each other at that level for customers and market share, much the same way that Nike is competing for customers and market share, say, with Adidas as first-party data holders. But unlike Nike and Adidas, the data brokers are also sharing data amongst themselves to improve the quality of their data sets to sell back to clients. So competition works differently at each level. And therefore, we're going to measure competition differently at each level. One in a way that is fairly intuitive, one in a way, I want to be very clear, I made up. So for those of you tuning in wondering, what's he going to say that's next? That's really crazy. We'll get to that in a second. But I've literally made up a measurement, and we'll get to that. So that's enough to hopefully have a little, what do we call them? Easter eggs, like in movies. So there's your little Easter egg that I've made something up, and we're going to look for it in a second. So we have different views on how competition and privacy interact. Competition could lead to more privacy, or in fact, competition may be at odds with privacy. So the top quote is by an Australian law professor who's been very, very aggressively pushing for the fact that competition and privacy work together. Below is, one of Catherine Tucker, I think one of the really spectacular empiricists focusing on privacy issues and competition issues, saying actually it's a bit more nuanced. And this is just to give you a sense. We talked earlier before we began about how a lot of this is political. Well, it turns out we're seeing a lot of scrutiny. And this is just an example, and a lot more has happened since 2019, but we're seeing a lot more scrutiny of, I'd say, all of digitization around the world. So we're seeing the push towards AI regulation, the push towards greater privacy regulation, the push towards competition regulation, to regulation of crypto and fintech. You name it, if it's digital, there's a push to privacy. A lot of times based on things we don't know. And that's a different set of papers, but we help to contribute to that. So overall, economics has changed a lot from the structure, conduct, performance paradigm from Joe Bain et al. All the way to the 1980s. But in fact, even econ still looks at concentration and market structure. to try to understand a little bit how competition works. So I note the paper by DeLocher, Eckhout, and Unger in the QJE, but certainly not the only one, looking at broader concentration where the HHIs that they measure are not the same thing that we would look at for antitrust markets, but they are drawing certain inferences on broadly how the economy works. Certainly, concentration in the data broker market actually does seem to impact how data brokers collaborate with each other and think about questions of privacy, and therefore also help us understand better essentially strategy involving selling information. So by I want to be careful what I say. I'm talking about highly concentrated markets. I'm not necessarily talking about monopolies as such, a single firm that is dominant. I can't draw those inferences, but this gives you a sense of the overall literature. It seems to work in two different directions. So why do we study data brokers particularly with information we find on the dark web? It's a great place to study when results seem to go up in two different directions, right? And do we have a unique contribution? The answer is we do, because we look at what's actually been leaked onto the dark web. More on that in just a second. So here's how we think about the kind of conduct where we're told that the market concentration is going to influence data sharing practices, and this gives you a sense of how it works. Again, we see some tension between the firms. Actually, some of these we're sort of making implications about data brokers, even though the papers themselves, for example, Tirol 1988 is actually not about data brokers. But just to give you a sense of how it works. And on the right, I give you the two different basic models of data brokers. How do you actually make money off of this, right? So one is based on an advertisement revenue multiplier model, or one is a cross-channel marketing model. And it gives you a sense of how they use cookies, et cetera, to basically monetize. So part of the texture and the richness of this particular area of study is that, what a surprise, we have differentiation in terms of strategy across digital firms. Okay. So we're looking in part on privacy protection outcomes, right? And there are two different ways of thinking about this. One is a traditional economics of privacy view. I cite to the Journal of Economics literature overview. I think it's really wonderful, has stood the test of time. We know more empirically, but overall, I think they do a wonderful framing. I should note Liad Wagman of that paper is a co-author of mine on something else. Lovely, lovely guy. But there's also, and this is where the strategy comes in, we can also look at a resource-based view, where the more, essentially, the more significant the firm is in an industry, the greater the likelihood that firm may have unique capabilities that somehow impacts their ability to achieve certain kinds of market outcomes, essentially performance. And the question is, well, how do we deal with monopolization on the one hand versus privacy violation on the others? It turns out, to use the management/strategy literature, this is essentially a non-price competitive strategy, a non-market strategy. So I want to spend some time just working us through what is it that we know. We know that there's information sharing. This came from the FTC study that they looked at 9 data brokers, and on the right you actually see what they found. I think we know a little bit more since then, but there's still a lot that we don't know. But this is, to the extent that we know something, this is what we seem to know. Large brokers in concentrated markets probably view data as a unique resource. They would keep it. Frankly, large first-party providers might be less willing to share data because they simply need less additional data. But there are reasons why you would share more, particularly in less concentrated markets. And we might infer in some cases, less concentrated means more competitive markets, right? You reduce costs, you get more value for data. But the problem is each time somebody else touches the data, there's the possibility that we might have a leak. And Sungwoo, you might ask a question. You didn't, but I'll just ask the question for you. You might ask the question, well, wait a second. I watched Goldfinger, great James Bond movie from the 1960s. If I were looking to rob a bank, I'd rob the biggest bank possible. Why don't I just go after the largest bank? Or you're from Korea, so you remember, what is it, Money Heist, the Korean version of Money Heist. The same kind of thing where they go into the mint to try to rob, 2 seasons on Netflix, it's great. By the way, I should also add, the person who came up with Squid Games, a USC graduate. So I just have to sort of throw every USC reference I can. But in fact, that's not how the world works. People don't go after, heavily fortified banks. They go after essentially the best bang for the buck. Where is it that they can really get data for the least amount of possibility that they're going to be detected, but for which they're going to be most successful? And that's the world we live in. So we might even think that the larger the companies, the more resources that they have, the more they're going to invest in high quality data security. So probably the soft targets are the smallest companies, but you're not going to get as much value if you're looking to steal from the smallest companies. So it's probably somewhere in the middle for the most part. This is what we think. We actually don't have a good sense because it turns out it takes a while to have data breaches detected, sometimes quite a bit of time, although we're now seeing a change literally just the other week in securities disclosure of when you have to disclose the data breach. But there are sometimes, data breaches have gone on years before we get disclosure. So we're going to then talk about the research questions of how do we look at various levels. So in a more concentrated industry, our partners, that is our first level firms, are they going to be more likely to share customer information with data brokers? And are we more likely to have data leakage? And then at the data broker level, we'll ask a similar question. The more concentration at the data broker level, does that lead to more or less information leakage, right? You share, it increases the chance of a privacy breach. Thankfully, we're asking the same set of hypotheses at different levels, so at least there's some kind of symmetry. So,
can I ask you just a quick question?
Sure.
Just out of my intuition, so as you know, the data is like a non-rival, just like you can just like copy it. If you have the data set, you can just copy it multiple times. So to the firm's perspective, what is the incentive not to sell to anybody? Yeah, if you're not worried about this like a security reason. So for example, if all the data brokers are just like their security level is like a decent, so they don't worry.
So hold on one second. So when you say the firm, at which level? First party firms or data broker firms? Because I think the incentives are different.
The first party,
Okay.
If they have the data, they're gonna, as you said, they're gonna sell the data to the data broker, right?
Right.
And if the first party firm does not care, already sure about maybe the security level of these data brokers,
right?
And they don't have any incentive not to sell to everybody, right?
Right. So this actually gets to some kind of question that's, you already allude to the fact that, well, most data can be used. Well, let's put it this way: data can be used more than once, and most data that you could collect, others can sort of potentially reverse engineer data that's the same or somewhat different. Could be because certain companies, look, if you have a data breach, you lose trust in customers. And what's the worst thing that you want? Customers to flee. So let me give you my favorite example of this. 2 data breaches happened at roughly the same time. Target and Home Depot. Home Depot's was actually larger in terms of the amount of data breach than Target. You would never know this, Why? Because they actually had a very good corporate governance plan in place of how do you deal with data breaches. They took ownership very quickly and immediately basically got some kind of credit watch for everybody for a year. No problem. Target is literally a case study of everything not to do. First, the CEO says, well, it's not a problem. Then he says, well, maybe it is a problem, but don't worry about it. And eventually he gets fired because it was a classic, crisis management situation gone wrong. What ended up happening was literally 20% of people who had the Target credit cards, literally, they stopped using it. So trust on the platform really matters. Why do you not want to share data necessarily? Because you may not trust the data brokers. And that means people flee your platform. Again, it's the same thing that happens in a traditional supply chain product recall. When a toy, let's say a Barbie, as you know, Barbie's very popular right now, given the movie. Don't know if it's made it to China yet. In the United States, hugely popular. But let's imagine, between Mattel, the company that produces Barbie, and the distributor and some suppliers, upstream even, there's some kind of problem that Barbie needs to be recalled because there's a little piece of let's say a shoe that little kids are likely to swallow because it wasn't made quite right. People don't blame the distributor. People don't blame, the upstream producer. They blame Mattel. So this is in part about brand and protecting the brand and protecting trust in the brand. No different than if this were a traditional product recall. Why do you not sell your data? You don't trust everybody else in this digital supply chain. But you can only do that if you have sufficient size that you don't need somebody else's data in quite the same way, because you have sufficient data. So I'm going to go to what we're looking at. Essentially, this is a self-regulated industry, fairly unregulated. And because it's self-regulated, we don't quite know what's going on. We do know who is lobbying Congress with regards to data brokers. Yes, the big four are data brokers, as it turns out. They make a lot of money, not from the accounting side. They make it from the consulting side and providing all kinds of, as you said earlier, services. But they're also doing more than just services. It's also buying and selling of data. Here's something else that I want to just remind everybody of. We do not have national privacy legislation in the United States. So we have privacy regulation in California. It's gone into effect. Some of it is quite significant. It looks in many ways like GDPR, though there are some differences. But one thing that we have is the data broker registry as a result of these changes. But we do not have national privacy legislation. We essentially have a number of different government agencies that play some amount of privacy function, of which the most prominent is the Federal Trade Commission, but it's not the same as privacy legislation. And this is just to give you a sense and a timeline of sort of what's happened with regards to greater transparency with regards to data brokers. So the first step would just be, if people have more information, maybe that will allow for all kinds of market corrections, and maybe we get some kind of standard setting or et cetera, but that's more private governance rather than some kind of legislation. But this is sort of where we are. Here we have what it looks like. You simply register as a data broker. And in fact, if you look on the right-hand side, that's exactly what you have, the data broker registry. It's voluntary. You don't have to register, but you do. And there are ways to opt out of the registration. By the way, I'll just already give you some results now. The companies that register are actually more likely to have better data practices. In some ways, I've already told you this is like a digital supply chain. Now I'm going to give you a different approach. So if this paper is, much like information systems that brings in strategy, that brings in marketing, that brings in, operations, this is the part of information systems that oftentimes we find in accounting departments. I'd say this is like a Sarbanes-Oxley story. What has happened is the companies that are publicly listed in the United States are the ones who frankly have better corporate governance practices. And not surprisingly, when you look at dual listed companies, say a Shanghai Stock Exchange / New York Stock Exchange company, not surprisingly, those are going to be the companies that have better corporate governance. And there's a certain amount, as you might imagine, of endogeneity there, right? Because you're more likely to list because you already have better practices. But this is just to give you a sense of what it looks like. Literally, this is what we did. We went off to Vermont and California data broker registries to see who registers. So this is where we understand our data sharing activities. Again, firms sell data to the data brokers then sell to other data brokers or to other firms, and at some point we have a privacy breach. And on the left, we give you a sense of how this works, and what we expect is actually our first-party data holders share customers with registered data brokers. Why? Because those ones are probably the higher quality ones. And so we look at the relationship between registered versus unregistered. By the way, we find the same way we find the data brokers who are registered to be higher quality, because that is fewer breaches onto the dark web. The more concentrated the firm is at either level, either at the firm level or the data broker level, the less likely we are to have information leakages onto the dark web. So how do you get this information? So think about third-party cookies, which is being phased out. And so that leaves us with first-party cookies to collect user data by themselves, and then you basically track. So again, this brings us back to the Google AdSense versus Oracle, how they're worked on, in terms of first party versus third party. I just, out of interest in time, I'm just going to move past this right now. So where does the data come from? So it turns out we obtain data for each firm's website over a period of time, looking at the Internet Archives is an API. We're able to then identify first-party cookies and data trackers from the HTML, and I actually have a screenshot of that so you can see what it looks like. And then we look at the cookie database. We look for the cookies that are actually implemented by the third-party brokers. Okay? So I'm actually going to show you what that looks like. This on the left, this is exactly what it looks like. How you get the HTML information, and what it looks like in terms of the cookie itself. I mean, this is like watching the Great British Baking Show. Like literally, we know every ingredient that goes into this cookie. And we can literally, therefore, know the entire history of the cookie. So how do we basically discover where leakages are? Again, these are only known data leakages. So we have a series of different databases that we go to and we combine the data. If you're a publicly traded company, you have to actually have that in the 8K because it's a material change, right? There's a privacy right clearinghouse. California now has a data security breach report. We get across a number of different ones, but this just gives you a sense of how we combine the data over the 5-year period. Now I want to talk a little bit about the dark web. What does it actually look like when data has been exposed? And what's the difference between the regular web versus the dark web? I think this is a great way of thinking about it. Everyday users versus some bad guys versus some very, very bad guys. The dark web is where really, really bad things happen. The kind of things that make for great Netflix series. So what you actually see here is what it looks like when there was a Spotify data breach. Somebody got the email, the password, what kind of subscription level they're on. They, by the way, paid for the subscription premium. By the way, I do that myself, totally worth it. And we look at the dark web post that mention the data broker's specific name, and we count each personal identifiable information in a given post. We make sure to reduce that number because we get rid of the duplicates. This is how we figure out what data has been breached. So you'll notice it's for a much shorter period of time, but we get almost 300,000 posts for the dark web. And then how do we figure out concentration? So,
sorry, so you can actually identify the name of these data brokers who gave the data to.
Yes.
Okay, wow, that's quite surprising.
Believe me, yeah. I thought my life was far more secure until I started this project. What we do to measure concentration, again, this is not antitrust market definition. This is broader concentration, but again, if it's good enough for a series of econ papers to do this, such as the DeLoker one in the QJE recently, I think we're on safe ground. So we used a Hoberg-Phillips TNIC database. So this is very interesting because it's a textual analysis that says actually what companies say that they are, the industry they're in, isn't really what they're in. And the way we'll figure it out is we'll actually look at their securities filings. And based on that, you can create an HHI. By the way, Jerry Hoberg, USC Finance, great academic, also great guy. That's fairly standard. You're seeing basically the Hoberg-Phillips database revolutionize finance and accounting and increasingly IS. That's fairly standard. What we do at the data broker level, literally, I made up. And I want to give you the motivation of how I made this up and why I made this up. So in the late 1980s, David Teese was concerned about intangible property, traditional IP, that maybe the way we were thinking about market definition wasn't quite right. So would there be some other kind of proxy that could tell us a little bit more about proper market definition? So we could have just done Hoberg-Phillips again, but that would have only gotten us our publicly traded data brokers. I wanted all data brokers, right? Back to your point of like, how do we know which of those 4,000 data brokers, like, how do we know how concentrated they are? So what we did, again, I made this up. So any kind of pushback, I'm happy to hear, because the first thing I'll ask you is, do you have a better measure? We went to GitHub and figured, how often are firms being co-mentioned in GitHub? So the greater the likelihood that the firm has a co-mention, the greater the likelihood that at least on some level, they're competing with each other. Are they competing with each other at the data broker level? Unclear, right? And frankly, even for Hoberg-Phillips, it's at such a broad level that you'd say, well, these firms don't technically competing against each other from an antitrust perspective. That's right, but we're not looking for an antitrust market definition. We're trying to look at a broader sense of market definition. So if somebody is tagged both on GitHub as both Facebook and Google, guess what? For our purposes, they're competing against each other, and that's the market concentration. It's an imprecise measurement, I will give you that, but unless you have something better, hold your disbelief, because in fact, we get exactly the same results as we did at the first level. The larger, that is, the more concentrated the market, the less likely there is to have a data breach. So I will fully admit, we have made this up, but I think it's also the least bad measurement that we have out there. And sometimes least bad is as good as we can get.
Hi, Danny.
Hi, how are you?
It's here from Luohan. I have one quick question on this measurement.
Sure.
So Google is a part, like for example, say Google or Amazon. or they collect data? Are they count as firms in your firm level market concentration and also counted as a data broker?
It's a great question. So for first party firms, we're only looking at Hoberg Phillips to understand that competition. It is the case that some firms are both first party and firms and data brokers. When that is the case at the data broker level, we're only looking at this made up concentration level at that level of, do you have co-mentions on GitHub? So we have two different measurements, essentially, one at each level.
Okay, then let's say I was thinking this HP provide this HHI measurement for different industries. Those industries could include the information service industry, right? Then it's like your measurement on firm level market concentration in the information sector will be highly correlated with the concentration measure in the data broker industry, right? For those particular industries.
Right. So I'm less worried about that only because it turns out most of the firms, that's not the industry that they're going to say that they're in. You know, under Hoberg Phillips. So you're right, that's something we should be concerned about, but in fact, that's not how most firms identify in their own securities filings. And the reason why I mentioned that is because the securities filings, if there's something that's wrong, you know, bad things happen. The SEC goes after you. Sometimes if the securities filings are wrong, frankly, so does the criminal division of the Department of Justice. So, when I say that, you know, in terms of information technology firms, it's not at that level. Most firms like that you think of as information technology firms, in fact, get listed as something else. So it's actually a very small segment of that first level firm. But it's a good question. So here's the descriptive data of what happens with time. So we need to have the website over time. We need to be able to have publicly traded firms. Oh, it should be Hoberg and Phillips, sorry about that. Which means you had to be in the database long enough, and that we actually need, these are publicly traded firms at that level. You need CompuStat data. As many of you who work with private firm data, whether it's like PitchBook or the Chinese like PE/V venture capital PitchBook equivalent or Crunchbase equivalent, that data is less reliable. Here we're using, at that first level, publicly traded information. So the total number of firms gets reduced from 8,800 all the way down to 470. And the observations also getting reduced. So again, we are limited by real world constraints of, you know, we can only use the data that exists. So I want to give you the description of data. We're looking for the number of privacy leakage incidents per year, number of data trackers that are actually controlled by those third-party data brokers. We're looking at the market concentration of firms at both level, both of the first party and the third party. We're looking at whether or not a partner has actually, the data broker has actually been registered in one or more of California or Vermont. California is going to be able to sweep a lot more companies under. And then this gives you a sense of what the descriptive data looks like. I want to now, with limited time, because I do want to have some time for Q&A, so I just want to very quickly go through the results, and then we can have some time for Q&A. So forgive me, I'm going to rush a little just based on time. So we have some very strong results here. Significant positive relationship, again, showing first-party firms are more likely to share with data brokers that are more highly concentrated. Again, thinking that size is a proxy for quality of essentially compliance. when you have high concentration at both levels, our partners, these are first-party firms, are more cautious in sharing their data with brokers, even when those data brokers are themselves highly concentrated. And it could be because they don't trust the data brokers as much, or because they just don't need to. Essentially, it's like a make or buy decision. Well, we make enough, we don't have to buy. So what do we also see? We do some kind of mean comparison, and we look at high and low groups, and firms with lower concentration have a higher mean customer privacy information leakage. So at both low level of market concentration of first-party firms and low level concentration of data broker firms, we have more data leakage. So just basically here, just more of the same that we've already seen before. I'm not going to go into detail because we already have only 10 minutes left for a Q&A. But basically, again, more of the same, and we can spend more time just working through some of the math in the slides later on. I do want to just get to the results. So here's the regression analysis. And so one thing that I want to explain that I think is very important, this is basically new data leakage. So some of you might be concerned, well, wait a second, this is data leaks from like 7 years ago. How do we know? You're like, why are you including that? Well, we're not including that. This is new data leakage since the information sharing. And the other thing I should also note is when we get to the level of what's on the dark web, we have fewer observations, yet still, I should note that we look at one dark web provider. And the reason why I mentioned that is because, in fact, different providers may have different information about that. There's no one dark web. It's not like it's a centralized area where all bad guys get together. There may be different dark webs out there, but this is one where people are monitoring and trading, et cetera, in terms of user information that they shouldn't do. By the way, in the dark web, they're also doing things like buying and trading like drugs, arms, et cetera. So there may be more covert stuff out there. This is what we can measure, though. And I'm just going to quickly go back to the findings so we can get to some Q&A. You share more in highly concentrated markets. And we believe that that's probably because with size comes the ability to basically pay for compliance. But if at both levels of concentration you have less sharing, and that suggests, the first-party firms are just more cautious. Basically, the more concentration you have in the market, the lower the concentration level, the more data leakage you have. In some ways, that looks a lot like what we see for the inverse relationship that we see, for example, for competition versus stability of a financial system. We're told, oh, we want to see lots of bank competition, except for when it threatens financial stability, because competition authorities have a very different view of this than do banking regulators. And actually, in many ways, our results look a lot more like that than they would of a pure competition authority trying to figure out, do we want to have competitive markets? Here, actually, sometimes more concentration, i.e., if we infer from concentration monopoly power, I'll say that's sometimes a big leap, but let's just go there for right now. The higher the concentration, the more market power. Actually, in this case, the more likely you're able to protect against data breaches. So I'm just going to stop there. This is us, multi-ethnic, multi-country world. Arian was born in Korea. David was born in Taiwan, and I was born in Panama. And all of us are in the United States. What a wonderful country. With that, I'm going to stop the presentation, and I'll take Q&A.
Oh, yeah, Daniel, thank you very much. It was really fascinating presentation. Yeah, I first wanna ask the audience if there's any question to the speaker.
Danny, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So here in your first finding, you show that the data brokers, basically in the market where data brokers have higher concentrations, the firms are more likely to share data. So
Yes.
is this due to the you are talking about the reasoning that the security concern maybe it's less severe?
So
could that be due to also the game?
Let me stop you right there. So although
Okay.
we say it as such in the paper, basically the fact that you register is a quality signal.
Oh, okay, okay.
Or at least this is how we are interpreting the data, that we don't use those words because there's a whole, as you know, separate signaling literature. But this is what I think is going on. You're signaling quality when you register.
Okay, then I was thinking, could that also be due to the signaling story you're talking about? If I'm a registered data broker, I can convey more value for the firms actually share data with me. So it's not actually due to the privacy concern or the security concern. It's actually due to the value exchange. Because I'm a small firm, I exchange my data with a big data broker in return.
So it's almost like an advertising story. The fact that that essentially I'm on the registry means that I'm more credible simply for being on the registry.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. Good observation.
Yeah, so I was thinking there's additional benefit and cost analysis on top of this maybe safety or a safety concern.
Yes. So I like that. That's really great. Thank you. Thank you. I like that.
Okay, thanks. And also a broader question, because I was doing studying the market power stuff several years ago. I was thinking that to what extent, as you motivated in the beginning, to what extent data sharing could contribute to the rising market power we can right now observed in the United States?
Right. So there are a series of different papers now looking at rising concentration.
Yeah,
so,
DeLocre paper you mentioned.
Yeah, so I just gave the example of the DeLocre one, but there have now been a series of them, all measuring slightly different things. So just because you have rising concentration, in some of the papers, that's actually not a bad thing. The rising concentration, for example, leads to more technological innovation in one of the papers. And but you know, to your overall conjecture, is more data leading to more market power? This is basically, you know, what is implicit in some of the cases against big tech, that, oh, you know, because they're large, they get more data. Because they have more data, they can exercise that market power in all kinds of ways. To date, you have not had that kind of story credibly result in liability for a firm in a competition law setting. We'll see. You know, right now there are government cases in the United States against both Facebook and Google. But to date, that has not been a winning story yet. Could it be? Unclear. Go ahead.
Yeah, and also to my knowledge, and those studies, like especially in DeLocre study, their measurement on the market power is actually very different. It applies to the traditional firm. It does not apply to the platforms.
Yeah. So they look across all industries.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the question that you have is essentially, is there something distinctive to the digital economy that makes things look different there with regards to market power?
Yeah.
This is the basis of the regulation, that somehow things are different. So I give you sort of the counter to all of these. Number one, as we see increased digitization, this is Eric Brynlofson and a bunch of his papers recently, like essentially every company is becoming an AI first company. They're all going through digital transformation. Essentially, we can think about companies, whether in China like Tencent or Alibaba, or in the United States, like Amazon or Apple. They were just that first wave of companies that use data, but essentially everybody's catching up. And how can I prove this to you? The number one essentially buyer of graduates in the United States of data scientists, it's not consulting firms like McKinsey or Bain. It's not companies like Microsoft or Google. It's actually financial services. And so that suggests to me that everybody is now investing, and increasingly you're seeing a change in companies of like chief data officer is now appearing on more org charts that in very traditional industries. But is there something different to sort of big tech firms? The answer is both yes and no. So we actually have some empirical work in this area. So for example, on tech acquisitions, I'm going to, there's this concern of self-preferencing. So I'm going to self-preference, either USC colleagues or co-authors for various papers. So tech acquisitions simply look different in terms of the stage of when you buy companies and sort of what you might be using them for, though, again, this is fairly nascent work. So for example, I have colleagues at USC who have a paper in MISQ that did an initial look 2 years ago to answer some of these questions, only at the very basic level. Milan Miric, for example, who's actually coming up for tenure this year. Ginger Jin and Liad Wagman have now a series of papers that are looking at tech acquisitions as well in econ journals. Ginger at University of Maryland, Liad at Illinois Institute of Technology, that suggests some things are the same, some things are different. But to answer your question, we still don't know. It's still too early to tell. And these markets are changing very quickly because everybody else is basically arming themselves with data. And simply we're just producing a lot more data in any given year than we did before. And I think more companies are basically able to better optimize their decision-making with data. So the answer, even of like the beginning of our study period, is probably different than the answer today. But I will leave it to the people who are doing the work, specifically to your question, to say it's still indeterminate. There are some differences and some similarities.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think we may have time for one more question from the audience.
Could you share a bit of what is your actual instrumental variable?
Okay, so here are the dependent variables. Here, is it not it? So we actually had a whole list of that. I think I accidentally removed that slide. I had such a slide in the prior draft, which I will put back in. So sorry about that. We did have a whole list of them, which of course now 1 hour in, I have forgotten, the way I sometimes forget the names of my children after a very long day. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, I think if there's no, time already passed. So I think we really want to appreciate the speaker for the wonderful presentation and to the audience for staying with us. And yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.